Hereditary is the kind of horror film you end up with when the director enjoys traumatizing you. It has one of the most disturbing climaxes in horror movie history, but Peter's final moments as, well, Peter, before the Demon King payment takes over might arguably be the most traumatizing scene in particular, in my opinion. Maybe even more frightening than Charlie's decapitation for many reasons that will eventually be explored later in this video. But first, here's some quick context. If you're a horror fan, which you probably are since you clicked on this video, you already knew from the thumbnail that this scene is from Hereditary, a 2018 movie written and directed by Ari Aster and distributed by A24. It was Aster's featured directorial debut and became A24's highest grossing film at the time, which is a major milestone for most horror films, and that's because of two key factors. One, Hereditary excels from a storytelling perspective. That's because it uses a lot of uncanny audio visuals to amplify its sense of unease. And it doesn't just rely on jump scares to scare the audience. It crafts an atmosphere so thick with tension and grief that the horror feels inescapable. And two, the cinematography. Aster intentionally tried to make the scenes inside the house cramped and, in his own words, a dollhouse aesthetic. The idea here is to make us feel like there's danger lurking everywhere by having disturbing silhouettes and the environment engulfed in shadows, while also misdirecting us with close-ups and ultimately reminding us that just like in a dollhouse, these characters are not in control and their fate has already been decided. In the scene we're going to discuss, Peter's character specifically has suffered a lot up to this point. There was his grandmother Ellen's passing, which is where the film begins with the obituary exposition. Then him accidentally killing his sister Charlie while ironically trying to save her due to the cult's manipulation, and then ultimately being tortured by one of the 8 kings of hell, Payman, and the cult before eventually discovering his charred father's corpse, his possessed demonic mom, and then meeting his own demise. Peter gets no breaks throughout this film and can barely find peace even when he's trying to sleep. Ari Aster ensures that Peter is only treated like the sacrificial lamb he is, and he wants this to be very clear and upsetting to the audience. This scene is not only riddled with many personal fears from Ari, but it shows his enjoyment of successfully traumatizing the viewer with many unforgettable, repulsive images. Although it's unfortunate for Peter, all of these misfortunes are crucial for the Demon King Payman to possess him. Peter being haunted by Charlie's death leaves him emotionally shattered. Then Annie becoming increasingly unstable and hostile towards him deteriorates his relationship with his family. And by the end of this sequence, Peter is left mentally and emotionally exhausted and defenseless. This leaves him as an empty vessel, which is the ideal vulnerable state to be inhabited by the demon Payman. The scene begins with a hard cut, transitioning from day to night as we can see that the house is completely surrounded by Ellen's fellow naked cult members. They all face the house like an audience ready to observe as Payman completes his ritual. And if we look closely, we can still see the flickering light on the trees from where Payman engulfed Steve in flames near the window. This scene is abrupt and shocking because it's thrust upon us as viewers, which is actually foreshadowing for Peter once we cut to the next scene where he's waking up and will also be thrust into his final moments. We open with a close-up here as Peter is awoken by a weird noise. For the moment, we're left to wonder what it is just like him. He looks out of the window where the candlelit ritual in the treehouse is waiting for him. This is Peter's last warning sign, which has been foreshadowed and constantly ignored by him throughout the film.
Because he literally refuses to look at all the signs that are being literally handed to him the entire play.
Interesting. So he thinks he has control.
When his mom slept there after Charlie's death, Peter could see the red light from the space heater through the window. And now that the cult is there with the candles, he sees an orange light. Red and orange are often colors associated with danger and warning signs, which is another reference back to Peter ignoring clear signs. And afterwards is where we get to see this first horrifying wide-angle shot. This shot is definitely creepy at first glance. Annie, possessed by the demon Payman, cling to the wall in the darkness above Peter. But that's only what we see. If we further observe the blocking of these characters, which is their position in the frame, it's very fitting that Payman is placed above Peter in the frame, because Payman is believed to be an angel who followed behind Lucifer in his rebellion against God. Given his high rank and powerful position in Hell, it makes sense that Payman would be placed high above Peter in this shot, and Peter on the other hand is insignificant and unaware of his impending doom. This is a common visual technique used in filmmaking to convey the power dynamics of their relationship. Then in this medium shot, we get to see our first sample of what Payman is capable of in a possessed body once the ritual is right around the corner. He silently floats through the air into the darkness while Peter is left once again vulnerable and clueless. Ari is purposely subverting our expectations here with Payman's slightly goofy but creepy way of leaving Peter's room. Although it's unexpected, it's very effective at complementing the unsettling tone. And it's also important to mention that throughout this sequence, Payman primarily holds a position of power above Peter in the frame. Only once does the dynamic change throughout Peter's final moments, and once we get to that scene, I'll further explain why this temporary shift happens. Once Peter steps into his parents' bedroom, we receive our first big narrative audio element from this sequence, outside of the constant buzzing sound of flies.
Mom? Dad?
And it's the sound of Payman ripping the cord from the piano that's later used to decapitate Annie. After Peter closes Charlie's room door, which was left open by the cult, we get another impressive wide shot here which not only shows how alone Peter is in this moment, but it symbolizes how the darkness is beginning to close in on him. And what's even more clever here is how it's revealed right afterwards downstairs in the bottom right hand corner of the frame that the wire was indeed stripped from the piano, connecting the visual narrative to the audio we heard prior. This can be easily missed because it's so subtle, but Ari is the type of artist that likes to take full advantage of the canvas. Every frame and visual motif had a deliberate purpose. Even now in this frame, there's a miniature to the left once again symbolizing control and manipulation. So one side is foreshadowing what's to come while the other side reinforces the narrative, with the subject Peter being the targeted focal point in the center. And now we're arriving at one of my favorite shots from the film, where Peter discovers his father, Steve's charred corpse, in front of the fireplace. And once he walks into frame, we the audience discover the demon Payman's new hidden positioning in the house, and he is once again positioned above Peter on the ceiling. And in a very twisted and traumatizing way, this is the last time we'll ever see the remaining family members all together in one frame again. This particular medium shot is actually overflowing with symbolism though, for several reasons. But first we'll talk about the blocking or positioning of the characters and not only Payman as previously discussed. We already understand that Payman is framed above Peter because it displays a position of power, and Peter is positioned below in a vulnerable and unaware position. But now we have Peter's father Steve positioned at the bottom of the frame. On the surface, Steve is positioned at the bottom on the floor because he's dead and he was burned alive. But beyond that, Steve represented good and normality in the Graham household. He sort of served as Peter's last defense or protector throughout their family's tragic dynamics. But Steve representing good has fallen, and Payman representing evil has risen. And finally, Peter, taking up most of the frame, is now the current focus. After cutting away to scan Steve's body and identifying that it's him from his wedding ring, we jump to a medium close-up, now cutting Steve completely out of the frame. Because just as Steve is no longer in the frame, it's also clear that he is no longer in Peter's life. It's a required part of Peter that he no longer has access to. There's a lot of anticipation here because we're waiting for Payman to attack, but he's waiting because Peter is actively being exposed to more and more traumatic events, which makes him vulnerable. And this element makes him more of an ideal host to eventually be possessed by Payman, the same way how Annie wasn't possessed until she witnessed Steve burning alive. Once Peter hears a noise behind him, he immediately goes out and then back into focus. And for a brief moment, Payman is in focus as though it's finally time for Peter to meet his demise. But instead, we get a brilliant misdirect as the camera pans away from the actual threat to reveal one of the naked cult members from his grandmother's funeral standing in a doorway smiling at him, once again adding to the trauma and preparation of Peter's vessel. And in this moment, Peter hears a knock from upstairs, redirects his attention to where Payman was, and hidden in the frame, Payman burst from the shadows, chasing Peter through the house and back upstairs to where he locks himself in the attic. From the moment nighttime arrives, Ari starts having a field day with tucking creepy cult people away in the shadows of the frames throughout this sequence. There's such an exceptional use of shadows here that it feels like it may require a couple rewatches to spot every hidden cult member. You might even begin to think that there's areas where they're lurking simply because it's so dark that you're unsure, and this is all intentional. What we witness throughout this film and this entire sequence stems from the director Ari Aster's greatest fears. He revealed during an interview that dying alone is one of his fears, which is basically what we see happening here with Peter since he's the last of his family to go. Then he says, "I'm afraid of being responsible for something horrible happening to someone I love and then not being forgiven." This, of course, is a reference to what happens to Charlie and how Annie never truly forgives Peter for what happened. And then he goes on to reveal how someone in his family turning on him is also one of his fears. How that's something he's not even aware of consciously, but how his nightmares as a kid were always of someone who matters most to him changing. And this is a reference back to how consciously Peter is unaware that Annie is possessed. And now she has changed and turned on him. So just as Peter is Payman's vessel, he is also Ari's vessel for us to experience his deepest fears vicariously through Peter. Now, once Peter makes it to the attic, here is where the dynamics change, as I mentioned earlier. And although this change in positioning isn't expressed in an actual camera frame, we understand that Payman is below Peter at this moment. But the reason why this is never expressed in an actual camera frame isn't simply because they're not in the same room. There's many camera tricks that can be done to show them on each side of the frame simultaneously. This is done because the idea of Peter's safety and control is only an illusion. Now, although Payman does become livid and vengeful when offered a female host, his frustration banging Annie's head against the attic door makes it seem as though Peter might be able to escape. Also, the close-up shot of him locking the door combined with the banging noise and even the music completely dies down as if to emphasize that Peter is getting one final moment of peace. But once again, Peter is not in control. He eventually notices all the candles the cult has left behind, but he fails to notice the cult member hidden in the darkness behind him. In this wide shot, we the audience may also fail to see this to share that unawareness with Peter. As previously mentioned before, Ari likes to take full advantage of the canvas. After Peter notices the candles and his photo on the floor symbolizing his death and being targeted by the cult, he tries to slap himself awake, hoping it's all a nightmare before hearing a grinding sound above him. This sound brilliantly activates an arc shot, swinging us back to a medium close-up tightly in front of Peter. Arc shots can circle completely around a subject or just move in a curved path like we see here, typically to portray emotional depth. At this time, Peter desperately needs a moment to gather himself, to try to make sense of what he's witnessing. But the sound design and arc shot combined with the medium close-up visually shows how he's being denied of any sympathy. And once he looks up, basically drenched in tears, there's Payman floating above him, slowly sawing off his mother's head with the piano wire. And Payman has once again reclaimed his position of power above Peter. Also, I think it's important to mention how in every scene during this sequence, Payman is already multiple steps ahead of Peter. In Peter's bedroom, Payman is already there before Peter wakes up. In the living room, Payman is already there waiting for Peter. He chases him and the ladder is already down for Peter to run into the attic. Peter thinks he's safe in the attic, but Payman moves through the walls and he is already there. This simply reiterates how Peter's demise is inevitable and inescapable. As Payman continues to saw away at Annie's neck, one of the naked cult members rings a bell that further startles Peter. And here is where Peter completely surrenders by jumping out of the window. After Payman is done beheading his mother for the ritual, he then takes full control of Peter. His final moments are arguably the worst of anyone in the film because he is tortured relentlessly. He literally wakes up into a nightmare, which makes this scene where he's trying to wake himself up align so well with what he's experiencing. But that's just the kind of sequence you end up with when the director enjoys traumatizing you. Guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I've been having a lot of fun creating these for you all, and I'm looking forward to creating a lot more. But as always, that's all I have for now, and thank you for watching.